More than 7 decades after the end of World War II, researchers continued to discover the true magnitude of Nazi atrocities. In 1945, roughly 2,000 Nazi camps were known to exist. Today, over 44,000 have been documented.
This is an untold part of the Holocaust and Nazi persecution.
Modern technology is helping a new generation of historians expose these forgotten camps, some found in completely unexpected places, including on Britain's Channel Islands.
It was a model occupation in that Hitler intended his plans for the Channel Islands to be a forerunner for that of the invasion of England.
No ruins, no commemorative plaques. It's hard to imagine that these locations once held concentration camps. One English researcher is determined to reveal their dreadful history.
And many buildings that we thought perhaps had been destroyed, even some buried evidence, became visible at that point.
Everywhere the Nazi army went, in every country they occupied, they built camps. In Norway, Hitler enslaved thousands to construct his extravagant Polar Line, the colossal and doomed railway to the Arctic. Local historians have discovered the remains of these long-forgotten camps, hinting at the hell now concealed behind these picture-perfect images.
Death rates are extreme. It's up to 70% of the first year.
Camps were built until the end of the war. Thousands of men would die working on these Nazi constructions that would never be finished or serve any purpose. At the massive Project Riese in Poland, a team of researchers is uncovering details about its neglected past and the prisoners who died there.
Probably it was one of the most terrifying places.
Through the work of these dedicated researchers and with 3D reconstructions, you are about to witness these overlooked but crucial histories in this exclusive investigation into the lost camps of the Third Reich. In the early 1930s, Germany was experiencing a horrendous economic crisis, and millions of Germans were left without jobs. In this challenging context, Hitler was able to exploit his countrymen's anger and fear.
Und hier ist vor allem das Glaube!
He promised to reassert Germany's place among the great global powers and pointed to Jews and Marxists as being enemies of the nation. On January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg named Hitler chancellor. The Führer quickly turned the country into a dictatorship and established the authority of his Nazi regime through the use of force.
As soon as Hitler rose to power, within days, a multitude of camps were opened all over Germany. The purpose of all of these camps was to terrorize political opponents, in particular the left, unionists, and even some conservative democratic activists.
After a chaotic start, the camps quickly got organized. In March 1933, 3 months after Hitler's rise to power, Heinrich Himmler, his SS chief, decided to use an old munitions factory in the village of Dachau, 15 kilometers from Munich, to incarcerate opponents to the regime. To run the camp, he chose a loyal Nazi supporter, Theodor Eicke. Dachau would serve as a template for all the other Nazi camps that followed. Eicke's method consisted in organizing everyday life in the camp around a series of extremely strict rules. In addition to a rigid framework governing the prisoners' lives and near constant punishment, he took perversion to the next level by introducing the system of capos, in which certain prisoners were put in charge of other prisoners.
Certain groups of prisoners were pitted against other groups, for example, communists against social democrats, or Germans, the first prisoners of the camps, against the many Polish people that followed. It was a matter of who would be given more food as opposed to less, who would be assigned to more dangerous jobs or, on the contrary, be spared the riskiest work. Groups that found themselves in more comfortable positions in the camp would do anything to avoid having their privileges taken away. That was one of the concentration camp's defining characteristics.
Ultimately, Eich's system was based on permanent terror and violence against the prisoners.
Not only did the prisoners have to follow orders immediately, but they also had to be constantly on their guard, because they could be attacked simply for saying the wrong thing. The purpose of sending someone to a camp was not necessarily to assassinate or kill them, but to break them. But if they died, that was acceptable too. That is the aspect that really marked how the concentration camps worked, and starting in 1939, paved the way for the sites where prisoners died en masse, simply because the value of human life within the camp system became relative.
Following political prisoners, and starting in 1936, the next categories to be arrested and incarcerated in Dachau included Romanis, asocial people, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals, considered as deviant by the Nazi regime. In 4 years, the number of prisoners doubled, reaching 11,000. The camp had to be expanded. In 1937, new construction began, while other camps were simultaneously being built on the same model all over Germany. On July 12, 1936, the Sachsenhausen camp opened north of Berlin, followed by Buchenwald near Weimar on July 15, 1937. The camps followed in the footsteps of Nazi expansion. In March 1938, Austria was annexed. On August 8th, the Mauthausen concentration camp opened near Linz. On November 25, 1938, Neuengamme opened near the Elbe. The pace increased even more as the war broke out. On September 1st, 1939, Germany attacked Poland. By the next day, September 2nd, the Stutthof camp was put into operation on Polish soil. Originally designed as a tool for repression, the camps took on a whole new dimension during the war.
As the war grew in importance, the economic demand for military supplies of all kinds increased exponentially. They needed more and more forced laborers. They began renting out prisoners at low cost to German companies run by civilians, as well as using them in factories built by the SS. So very early on in the war, by 1939, they had built an entire economic system that was based on the camps.
Laborers from the camps proved to be very useful for Hitler's large-scale European projects. Camps were built everywhere the Reich's army went, some in very surprising and completely forgotten locations, such as those on the British territory of the Channel Islands off the coast of the Cotentin Peninsula. On the smallest island, Alderney, an area of just 15 square kilometers, 4 camps were built. There, some 7,000 prisoners were held, and nearly 1,000 died, although that number is contested. A violent, little-known piece of the past, these camps have completely disappeared from the landscape, yet remain a sensitive topic. Their story began very early on in the war. On May 10, 1940, Nazi troops invaded France. In less than a month, they had beaten the Allied troops and made their way south. The British decided to evacuate their troops posted on the continent in order to better defend Great Britain. Along the way, they also abandoned the Channel Islands, located off the French coast.
The British government sent a token force of troops here, but they were withdrawn. And the islanders here, particularly in Alderney, were left in some dismay as to what should be their future. The church bells rang on the morning of the 22nd of June, and the islanders went down to the harbour, where the British had sent 6 small transport ships to take them to England.
In July 1940, German troops landed on these small islands. For Hitler, getting his hands on this piece of British territory was a welcome PR move.
The occupation of the Channel Islands by German forces inevitably became a great propaganda coup for the Germans, and Hitler in particular. Goebbels' ministry made a great play of the occupation.
The new propaganda films showed the German army in an English setting. These surprising images were intended as previews of the Reich's future conquests.
It was a model occupation in that Hitler intended his plans for the Channel Islands to be a forerunner for that of the invasion of England. And of course, in 1940, this was still his intention. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of England, was under preparation on the French coast.
This invaluable conquest had to be defended at any cost. As soon as they arrived on the islands, the German soldiers began building fortifications, which would become part of the massive Atlantic Wall project. Starting in 1942, with the Reich's offensive to the east, this construction was entrusted to a different Nazi organization.
Early in 1942, it became necessary to commit the organization TOT to take charge of the construction work that was planned for the Channel Islands and indeed for the whole of Western Europe.
Organisation Todd was set up in 1933 by Dr. Fritz Todd, after whom it was named, and essentially it was an administrative entity. So the members of Organisation Todd swore an oath of allegiance to Hitler, and they wore Nazi uniforms with OT insignia on. But what they were responsible for was supplying labour, ultimately, from 1938 onwards in particular, supplying labour for construction projects across the Third Reich.
From its beginnings, the organization TOT had always used forced laborers when necessary. When it took over construction of the Alderney fortifications in 1942, it created 4 camps to hold prisoners of war and civilians from Eastern European countries that had been conquered. They would provide the labor for the numerous construction sites on Alderney.
The program for Alderney was fixed at 375 permanent works. These are the heavy designs in reinforced concrete, which demanded incredible amounts of material. You must remember there was no timber in Alderney. That had to be brought to the island along with the cement, the reinforcing steel, the armor plating, in addition to all the other materials that would be required in the defense works.
It was very intensive. Many of them were physically exhausted. They were not fed very well. They were not appropriately clothed, and they were working with, with their bare hands a lot of the time, and with inadequate machinery. They were doing this manually in most cases. The whole island of Alderney is covered with concrete fortifications that they were building.
It was in these extreme conditions that more than 24 fortifications were built on this 3 by 5 kilometer piece of rock in just 2 years. From July 1943 on, the islands found themselves increasingly isolated. Harried by the English Navy, they faced a scarcity of provisions. Lacking food and building materials, they were forced to bring construction to a halt.
The rate had slowed considerably by that time. In fact, in Alderney, by mid-July, they had stopped building anti-tank walls, and a month later, they had stopped building or creating tunnels, underground storage facilities on the island. In fact, of the 86,000 cubic meters of cement that were eventually poured in Alderney, we estimate that that is less than 50% of the planned program.
In late 1943, the prisoners were evacuated and sent to other camps on the continent. The fortifications on Alderney would never serve any purpose. The Allied Navy would sail around the islands to carry out the D-Day landing. It wasn't until after the surrender of the German armies on May 16, 1945, that the British regained control of the islands. The people returned. Theodore Pontcheff, a British officer, investigated what had happened in the camps. With no witnesses and no survivors, the buildings were dismantled for firewood, and the archives went up in smoke. All that remained were the graves of the prisoners who had died on the island, as well as 3,000 German soldiers. The British officer suspected mistreatment and criminal acts, but no German officers were ever brought to trial.
There was found to be evidence of systemic violence, and papers were prepared to indict a number of German personnel who were here. SS men from the camp here in Alderney were never brought to trial.
It didn't chime with the view of Britain as the victors and not the victims of Nazi persecution, and obviously Britain had just won the war.
After the war, survivors came out of the woodwork and began to speak. The true extent of the violence was brought to light. It is even suspected that two of the camps, Sylt and Norderney, which were run by the SS, were concentration camps. But no official investigation was ever conducted. In 2010, when Caroline Sturdy Coles arrived in Alderney, the story of these camps still had not been told.
I was just really shocked to discover what had happened on the island and how little that was known by the general public. And so I felt like we needed to explore this as an untold part of the Holocaust and Nazi persecution, because there is often the belief that the Holocaust happened elsewhere in mainland Europe, and actually that it isn't something that happened so close to home for us. And as an archaeologist, obviously, I was very aware that the evidence hadn't really been investigated on the island very much. So although some investigations had taken place in 1945, they'd only been there for a short time. And obviously they didn't have the tools that we have today. And so I felt that the modern techniques of archaeology could really bring new perspectives on those crimes.
The local authorities did not give the archaeologist permission to dig, so she used cutting-edge technology to probe the soil without digging, and chose to concentrate on investigating the camp of Lager Sylt.
We've worked with people, for example, in 3D visualization technologies, even in games design, to utilize 3D modeling in order to reconstruct what the camps look like. And those techniques really were so insightful in that you could suddenly see the outlines of barrack foundations. You could suddenly see those fence lines much more clearly. Even if that evidence didn't exist on the ground, LiDAR is capable of penetrating the ground surface to shallow depths as well. So even some buried evidence became visible at that point. And many buildings that we thought perhaps had been destroyed, we found the traces of those foundations. So that's why it's so important to go back and look at sites like those on Alderney with the fresh eyes that forensic archaeological methods can bring.
The archaeologist was able to bring the Sylt camp back to life. She was even able to piece together its history through the physical evolution of its buildings. Originally a labor camp, it developed over time to house more prisoners. In just 2 years, it grew from 300 prisoners to 1,000. The most important change occurred after the SS took command in March 1943, when the number of prisoners jumped to more than 1,500. To this researcher who has studied Nazi camps all over Europe, there is no doubt about it. Under SS command, the Sylt camp checked all the boxes of a concentration camp.
New fences were built, prisoner segregation from the guards was made much more effective and tightly controlled. There were gate posts built both at the entrance to the camp but also in the inner compound, and guard posts were placed around strategic points around the perimeter of the camp in order to monitor movement inside the camp and prevent movement outside the boundaries as well. So we start to see very much common architectural features coming in that you see in concentration camps elsewhere in Europe.
Another trait shared by SS camps is a house for the commander, built outside the camp but linked by an underground passageway. The architecture also provides insight into the prisoners' difficult living conditions.
The archaeological works on Alderney have provided many new insights into the crimes that were carried out on the island, and importantly, new insights into the lives of the people who were sent there. The architecture can tell you about their daily experiences, and it's enabled us to document the barracks and their size. So these buildings essentially gave people no more than 1.49 square meters of space to live in the buildings. They were crammed into these structures. They were usually about 28 by 8 meters long, and you had hundreds of people crammed inside, which was just a breeding ground for typhus, for other diseases, and for terrible living conditions.
The type of prisoners held in the camps also changed under SS command. In Sylt, the prisoners now came from the Neuengamme concentration camp. In Alderney, they were primarily French Jews who had been captured and held in Drancy, men who were married to non-Jewish Aryan women, which spared them death in a gas chamber, but not imprisonment or forced labor.
The camp commandant was an SS Untersturmführer. He was a member of the Nazi Party. So he essentially then ran Alderney like a concentration camp alongside his deputy. And there was a large contingent of Jews in Alderney camp, and certainly they were subject, alongside the Eastern European prisoners, to brutal treatment that was equivalent to the treatment that was carried out in other SS concentration camps in Europe and also in Sylt.
According to the investigation conducted after the war, an estimated 800 prisoners died in these camps. The story survivors later told of the many people who died of sickness and malnutrition, violence, and summary execution, as well as bodies buried on construction sites and thrown into the sea, give us reason to believe the number of victims was actually much higher. The work done by the English researcher has revealed part of the past of these Nazi camps on British soil, but without permission to dig, the rest remains hidden. Elsewhere, however, archaeological digs have been used to uncover the forgotten past of other camps, such as in Norway. Near the fjords of Trondheim, located in central Norway, lies the site of the most violent camp in Norwegian history, Falstad. Here, the most stubborn prisoners of war were held and tortured alongside Norwegian resistance fighters. Jewish people captured by the Nazis were also held here before being deported to Auschwitz and the gas chambers.
Falstad, first of all, it's one of the biggest camps, and it was a special camp because it was run by the SS and it was punishment camp. So prisoners that Nazis meant deserved punishment were sent to Falstad, either for to stay in Falstad as prisoners or for execution.
If Falstad didn't sink into oblivion, it's because it relied on solid buildings. The structure, modeled on 19th century German prisons, was originally a boarding school for difficult children. In 1940, when the Nazis invaded Norway, they built 2 more barracks to hold up to 800 prisoners. Watchtowers, a commander house located a few meters outside the camp, and a gate with an inscription over it completed the site's transformation into a typical Nazi camp. 4,200 prisoners were held there. An estimated 200 are believed to have been executed in the nearby forest. After the war, the barracks were dismantled, the building became a school again, and the past was hastily put behind. This was unacceptable to archaeologist Marek Jasinski, who decided to launch an archaeological dig in the early 2000s.
The landscape doesn't say anything about the horror of the camp during the war. So what could we do? Could we employ archaeological method and try to find out if there is something beneath the ground, beneath this beautiful grass you have around the main building? So I started to make first very small trial excavations, small trenches. and we realized that there is a lot, that the history lies beneath the ground. We found glass and small fragments of textiles, of shoes. What we found was a lot of information mainly from everyday life in the camp. What they were eating, what was their eating vessels, what they were drinking. So it brought the everyday life in the camp to the surface.
The work done at Fallstadt ensures the camps created under Nazi occupation are not forgotten. More than 500 camps were built all over the country. Over 100,000 men were held prisoner, and 15,000 of them died there. Yet they were completely forgotten for many years. You are about to hear their painful story. On April 9, 1940, the Reich's army launched an offensive in Norway, which had joined the Allies after Poland was invaded by the Nazis. Norway was of vital strategic importance to the Fuhrer. All the iron ore from Sweden was transported via Norwegian ports, and taking the country would also mean having a stranglehold on the Baltic Sea.
Norway is extremely important for Hitler from the end of 1941. He's calling Norway the fatal zone of the war. It's here up in the north where the war is won or lost.
It only took 2 months for the armies of the Reich to win their campaign. Some 400,000 German soldiers invaded the country. Massive construction projects were launched to create the Festung Norwegen, which translates to the Norwegian fortress. It would become the northern part of the Atlantic Wall. In 1941, the Germans began building some 30 forts and gun turrets, along with 4 underwater bases intended to secure the coast and the North Sea. These colossal projects would require huge amounts of materials.
A lot of resources were needed. Like one figure, to build just one of the submarine bunkers that were part of, in a way, this Atlantic Wall. It took actually the total cement, the concrete production of Norway was put into just that one construction. And they were constructing a lot of those, or at least 3 or 4 of those bunkers. So they needed to import enormous amount of concrete from Germany.
No expense was spared, as the cement and concrete were imported from Germany. Hitler had grand plans for the country. One of them was particularly important to him: the insane plan to build a railway line that would connect the south of the country to the northern tip, reaching above the polar circle, the Polar Line. Building a railroad up to the Arctic along a steep coastline crisscrossed by fjords would require them to dig no fewer than 93 tunnels and construct 40 bridges more than 10 meters long. Hitler wanted to complete this monumental project as quickly as possible, regardless of the quantity of materials required by his immoderate scheme.
Some calculations with the need of steel for the construction of the Arctic Railway. As I mentioned, this was 1,300 kilometers building of new rails, and they needed wood for the dwellers, the sleepers, and steel for the rails, and only for the rails it was the amount of steel that equivalates like 12 Eiffel Towers, only for the rails. And then they also needed steel for the concrete constructions and everything, so the needs were enormous.
These massive projects were entrusted to the Einsatz of Viking, a subdivision of the organization TOT, created in Norway. But they needed a larger workforce. Much larger. Putting the Norwegians to work as forced laborers was out of the question. The Nazis considered them as the model of the Aryan people. There were just under 2,000 Jews living in the country, but in the name of their racial ideology, the Nazis refused to send them to the work camps.
Einsatzgruppe Viking actually wanted to use Jews in Norway. And this happened just at the same time as the Norwegian police started to arrest Norwegian Jews, but they were all sent to Auschwitz for the gas chambers. They were not allowed to be used for construction work in Norway.
The Nazis believed that Jewish people were destined to die, nothing more. Starting in 1942, with the implementation of the final solution, Norwegian Jews were captured, transported by boat to the German coasts, and put on trains to extermination camps to be gassed. The Nazis used the same boats to bring back people from the eastern countries that had been conquered and sent them to work on the Norwegian construction sites as slave labor. 100,000 Soviet prisoners of war and 10,000 civilians arrived in Norway. 500 camps were created, some of them in the northern part of the country, where the polar line was being built.
All in all, there are 60 camps along this, like 350 kilometer stretch of new railway to be built. So actually, it's one camp every 5 kilometers.
But these camps were built in a hurry. They were in no way prepared to house prisoners in a place where temperatures commonly drop below 30 degrees Celsius. The first winter was extremely hard on the prisoners.
When the first prisoners came in the summer of 1942, the camps were not ready, they were not finished, the constructions, and they did not have any system for supply, and they could never be sure that they could sleep all night without freezing. It was not barracks, it was like, they call it Swedish tents. It's a very primitive hut, not even a floor, it's only the soil on the ground. The conditions are extreme and it's terrible.
Despite the terrible conditions, an SS general on his inspection rounds was alarmed to see prisoners cutting up wool blankets to keep themselves warm. He saw this as wasteful, so he suggested giving them paper blankets in order to save money.
I would like to emphasize that it is inappropriate to give items of such value to the Russians, because previous experience has shown that prisoners will cut up wool blankets and such to make scarves and covers for their feet. Instead, and if necessary, I suggest we distribute pillows and blankets made of paper filled with wood chips.
This first winter was fatal to many of the slaves of the polar line.
So people died in hundreds and thousands. The death toll, the death rates are extreme. It's like up to 70% of the first year.
In spring, construction resumed. But on the Eastern Front, the tables had turned. Ever since the Battle of Stalingrad, the Reich's army had been losing ground. There were no new prisoners of war arriving in Norway. They didn't have enough food either. Conditions quickly took a turn for the worse.
The final phase of the war, the spring of 1945, also very dramatic, especially in Nordland County, on the different camps on the Arctic Railway, because generally supply was very poor in this time. So we have some devastating reports. Almost all of the workers are not capable of doing any work. So, as they say, efficiency is going down. Not so hard to guess. Of course, the conditions extremely bad.
In the end, no tunnels were completed, no bridges were built, and no rails were laid.
If you look at the original plans and the original intention, this was in a way a disaster in a ground format. So it was not possible to ride one single kilometer on the train. This was, right from the beginning, mission impossible.
In late April 1945, the Red Army liberated Norway and the prisoners of the camps. An estimated 15,000 prisoners died in them. But the story of these camps and their prisoners doesn't stop there. After the war, graveyards and memorials appeared all over the country to commemorate the victims. But this would not last. Just 1 year later, the Soviets, Norway's former ally, became their new enemy in the Cold War. The Russians were no longer welcome in Norway.
In 1946, 1947, Soviet representatives are starting to travel around, and especially in Norway. This was in the beginning of the Cold War, and the issue was more and more pressing for the Norwegian defense authorities, that they didn't want any Soviet representatives running around in northern Norway, and they got really stressed what to do with this question. And then in 1948, they start to plan the so-called Operation Asphalt.
The authorities feared the Soviets might take advantage of visiting the tombs of their countrymen who had died in Norway to spy on them. They made a radical decision, moving the tombs and the bodies. The nickname for the operation came from the bags that were used to contain the human remains, which originally contained asphalt to build the roads. 8,000 bodies were moved to Chota Island off the Norwegian coast.
Then we also see that at some places the Norwegian authorities are destroying the monuments because, and the argument is that they didn't want to see Soviet symbols in the Norwegian nature.
Without a single graveyard or monument to commemorate what had happened, the memory of these camps and their prisoners was erased. By the 1990s, the history textbooks used in Norwegian schools didn't even mention their existence. The camps and their 100,000 prisoners nearly fell into total oblivion. During the Cold War, the Russian survivors of these camps were unable to visit the graves of their friends who had died in Norway, which is an important part of preserving memory. More than 75 years after the liberation of the camps, the direct witnesses of this period of history are disappearing. Researchers and historians must now call upon other methods to find the lost camps.
Is it the floor or the ceiling?
It's the floor.
I see.
It's attached to this.
But these bricks aren't attached.
This forest lies in the heart of the Sudets mountain range in southern Poland. In this region, dozens of camps have been erased from the landscape and memory alike.
We are a team of researchers who are interested in reconstruction of location and history of labor camps. Now we have rests of camp buildings. We are close to Propambly camp kitchen, and in some other places in this forest we have traces of other buildings, which means living buildings or lavatories or something like that.
This was the Safevasser camp, made up of just 10 buildings, 5 of which were barracks that housed 800 prisoners. 3 inmates shared a single bed. When 2 were working, the third could sleep. For 2 years, they slaved away day and night for one of the largest secret Nazi programs of the end of the war, Project Riese, which means giant in German. This camp is part of a constellation of subcamps created in the Sudets near the end of the war. At the time, this part of northeastern Germany was spared from the Allied bombs, for it was out of range of airplanes taking off from London. The Nazis decided to move their factories to this location. The laborers were Jews from the nearby Polish concentration camps of Auschwitz and Gross-Rosen. They would become slaves to Project Riese. Starting in April 1944, over 13,000 prisoners were spread across 15 camps. They simultaneously built 19 kilometers of tunnels on 7 different sites in the Owl Mountains. One of these sites is located beneath Kisaz Castle, where the elevators connect the second floor to a network of corridors 900 meters long and up to 50 meters deep. With its command rooms and bunkers, this underground network was supposedly intended as a shelter for Hitler and his general staff, who were being harried by Allied bombs in Berlin. Since the archives were destroyed and the project never completed, historians are still debating the purpose of this gigantic undertaking, which covers an area of nearly 25 square kilometers. Some galleries, such as that in Osowska, are more than 10 meters tall, creating caverns of up to 6,000 cubic meters. They were carved in gneiss, one of the hardest rocks in the world. It is estimated that the excavation required the dynamiting of more than 2 million cubic meters of rock. This backbreaking work was done under extremely difficult conditions. All year round, the temperature in these caves never rises above 8 degrees Celsius, and it is constantly damp. For this colossal project, the Nazis ended up calling on Jewish prisoners from the nearby camps of Auschwitz and Gross-Rosen. To these prisoners, who were destined to die, being sent to work camps represented a glimpse of hope to survive.
Let's not forget that by 1944, it was becoming increasingly difficult to find the laborers they needed. There was a labor shortage. Since the lives of Jewish people were considered worthless, they were forced to do this work, even though the Nazis knew it was beyond their strength. No one cared if they lived or died. But paradoxically, when some of the Jews being held prisoner in Auschwitz heard about the recruitments for these work camps, they did everything they could to get on the trucks headed there, because it represented a chance at survival, even if the living conditions at the labor camps were very difficult, with rudimentary housing and extremely hard living and working conditions.
The work conditions were horrific. The prisoners worked more than 12 hours a day and were given next to nothing to eat. An estimated 5,000 prisoners died on these construction sites. The others were sent to other concentration camps before the Allies arrived. In the end, very few of them survived. After the war, the Potsdam Agreement gave Silesia to Poland. The German population was chased out, and the camp buildings crumbled. With few survivors and no remaining direct witnesses or physical evidence, these camps were forgotten. It wasn't until the 2010s that a group of researchers from the Warsaw University of Technology decided to delve into their past. Their investigation began with a single photo of the region, the only one known to have been taken by the Allies in 1944, which was found in American archives.
The quality of the photo was poor, which is a common problem with pictures like these. But it was the only one at our disposal, so we had no choice. The photo had many drawbacks. First, the scale, 1/43,000, which means that 1 millimeter on the map represents 43 meters of land. Because of that, it's impossible to see certain objects like fences on the photo. Some buildings are visible, but only large ones. Smaller buildings can sometimes be completely invisible. The second drawback of this photo is its quality and interpretive value. The photo was taken through a layer of mist, so the interpretive value of the photo was limited. Along the same lines, the snow on the ground also made it difficult to spot the buildings we were looking for. In spite of all this, all the camps were visible. Of course, we were unable to identify the objects that I mentioned, such as fences, but the main buildings were visible.
Sebastian superimposed the picture over more modern photos, but by the 1960s, some buildings had already disappeared. The researcher decided to use LIDAR technology, which consists in using lasers to scan the Earth's surface to detect the imprints left by the weight of a building on the soil. Finally, Sebastian superimposed all these different images, then cross-referenced them with the few testimonials left by survivors of the camps.
Wykorzystywaliśmy również relacje świadków.
We also used testimonials from the prisoners themselves. But when we studied them, we were really looking for spatial information. For example, this entailed the shapes of the buildings, or their height, as well as the fences mentioned by the prisoners of these camps. We searched the testimonials for specific elements like those. In many cases, the prisoners described the layout of the buildings in such a way that we could recognize them on the aerial photos. For instance, they described the 4 barracks you can see in the aerial shots.
With this knowledge in hand, Sebastian was able to project the location of the camp buildings onto a modern map. Then came the final step, finding them out in the field. When they reached the first site, the research team encountered their first problem. Over time, the remains of some of the camps had been transformed by urbanization. These small houses are actually former camp barracks. The workers who were taken from the extermination camps were sent here first to ensure they did not have any contagious diseases before being deployed to work on the construction projects. But these structures were not built to last. Within minutes, Adam, the team's building expert, identifies massive problems with the construction.
The mortar they used is practically pure sand. There's no cement or anything.
There's no foundation, and the roof is placed directly over walls built from a simple row of bricks, evidence that the buildings were very poorly insulated. Nevertheless, some 75 years after they were built, these very rudimentary houses still have people living in them.
They are on the site and probably are mostly original. Originally, it was a construction only for temporary use, and now it's working as so-called social flats for Bushica community.
There are no plaques or signs explaining how these buildings were used during the war. But they've been maintained and have survived, which is rare. The camps built for Project Riese were only designed to last as long as it took to finish construction, 2 or 3 years at most. Those built in the countryside have almost completely disappeared. Once again, the only camps to have survived are those that were built around older, sturdier structures.
We are on the rest of original fence of the Dornau factory and labor camp, which was situated here.
Dornau is one of the most infamous sites associated with Project Riese. This complex of a dozen buildings centered around an old 2-story factory was turned into a textile factory after the war. This is where prisoners were sent when they were sick, injured, or otherwise unable to work. It may have been called a hospital, but in reality, people were sent here to die.
Probably it was one of the most terrifying places of this Arbeitslager system, because it was a place where the people were sent to die.
Unable to walk, the prisoners detained here could not be moved after the war. They were liberated by the Red Army in April 1945. They were among the few survivors of Project Riese. They provided precious testimonials, some accompanied by drawings, such as these by Imre Horo, which tell of the horror of their everyday lives and the frequent death that struck the weaker prisoners. An estimated 2,000 people died here.
At the beginning of this construction site, dead bodies of the prisoners were sent by trucks to the KL Grossrosen, where the body were cremated. When the military situation was changed, and German army have significant problems with gasoline and other materials. The bodies were buried nearby the Dornhau, but the location is still a matter of discussion.
The exact location of the graves hasn't been identified yet. Bones are uncovered from time to time during construction projects. The team still hopes to find other statements kept in Russian archives, which were inaccessible during the Cold War.
A lot of work is to do, especially to locate and obtain information from the archives, especially the Russian one. Soviet army collected an enormous number of documents from this region. And of course, the digitalization of this document will give us opportunity to find some more detailed description of this whole story.
The team also hopes to turn this abandoned factory into a museum and, like at Fallstadt, make it a memorial to the forgotten camps. More than 75 years after the war, and all over Europe, thanks to new technologies, these researchers continue to shed light on this dark period in our history, which still has many secrets to tell.